Hello, my name is Lawrence Sagasta. My narrative is based on the idea that some students whose goal to pursue a certain career may have a dilemma. The dilemma being that their goal is based upon the culture of the family and not based upon what they themselves want to pursue. Life is not just about overcoming challenges. Literature and learning is not just about retention. The intertwining of both gives the opportunity for a person to build on who they are and to create a unique individual whose ambition is to rise above and passionately pursue life's great experience. This narrative is based upon the movie A Dead Poet Society, or The Dead Poet Society. Mr. Keene, who's a professor of poetry at a private boys' school, is about to teach these boys the importance of being themselves, about learning and taking their education and applying it to themselves and their heart. Now, most of these boys are going to go on to school to pursue careers as a business school, doctors, attorneys, whatever it may be. But the teaching of Mr. Keene causes them to really focus on themselves and how they can be an individual in amongst a very strict society. This part of the movie begins with Mr. Keating handing the boys out their textbooks. He's at the front of the class, and there's a few students. Neil Perry, he is one of the students that has a passion for acting, but instead is going to go on to be a doctor because that's what his parents said he needed to do. They're no doubt paying for his education, so why shouldn't he do what his parents tell him to do? Cameron, he is one of the students that's more of a nerd, follows the orders, follows directions. He basically will do what he's supposed to do. And then there's also a few others that are involved in this reading as well, but those are two of the key characters. So Mr. Keaton tells the boys, he tells the boys, "Gentlemen, open your textbook to page 21 of the introduction. Mr. Perry, will you read the opening paragraph of the preface entitled Understanding Poetry?" Neil begins reading. Understanding Poetry by Dr. J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D. To fully understand poetry, its meter, rhyme, and figures of speech, then ask two questions. How artfully has the objective of the poem been rendered? And two, how important is that objective? Question 1 rates a poem's perfection. Question 2 rates its importance. And once these questions have been answered, determining a poem's greatest becomes a relatively simple matter. Mr. Keene, upon Neil's reading, goes up to the chalkboard and begins to draw a graph. Neil continues. If the poem's score of perfection is plotted along the horizontal line of the graph, and its importance is plotted along the vertical, then calculating the total area of the poem yields a measure of its greatness. Keating draws a corresponding graph. Neil continues. A sonnet by Byron may score high on the vertical, but only average on the horizontal. A Shakespearean sonnet, on the other hand, may score high both horizontally and vertically, yielding a massive total area, thereby revealing the poem to be truly great. As you proceed through the poetry of this book, practice this rating method. As your ability to evaluate poems in this matter grows, so will your enjoyment and understanding of poetry. Very interesting is the fact that these boys are learning about a culture from centuries and centuries ago of great poets and poetry who has touched the lives of human beings who aspire to be great in themselves. And yet these boys are learning to grade poetry on a metered scale. Is poetry only good if it meters high, and useless or meaningless if it meters low? Well, that's what Mr. Keating is going to explain to these boys. So after Neil gets done reading the introduction, he takes off his glasses. The other boys in the class have at this point seemed to have lost all concentration. They're no longer thinking about what's being read. Some are eating, some are drawing on their books, on paper. There's no concentration at this point. Mr. Keating stands up in front of the boys and says, excrement. That's what I think of Mr. J. Evans Pritchard, PhD. We're not laying pipe. We're talking about poetry. Cameron, one of the students, who's very detailed with his note-taking, looks down at his copied notes and scribbles it out so as to think to himself, have I made a mistake? What am I learning here? Charlie, who is one of the class clowns, who really could care less about what he's learning, all of a sudden becomes interested in class at the comment of Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating says, I want you to rip out that page. The students look at Mr. Keating as if he's lost his mind. A textbook in a private school? Not going to happen. Mr. Keating says, go on, rip out the entire page. You heard me. Rip it out. Rip it out. Charlie looks around at the others. Then he looks down at his own notes, which consist of drawings that are inappropriate. He looks at the page, rips it out, and holds it up so as to have a victory, a self-victory for his own passion in life. Mr. Keating says, thank you, Mr. Dalton. Gentlemen, tell you what, don't just tear out that one page, tear out the whole introduction. I want it gone, history, leave nothing of it. Rip it out. Be gone, Mr. J. Pritchard Evans, or Evans Pritchard, Mr. PhD. Rip, shred, tear. Rip it out. I want to hear nothing of Mr. Pritchard. Meeks, one of the students, looks around reluctantly and finally begins tearing out pages with the ruler so to have a very specific line. Mr. Keating says, well perforated, Mr. Meeks. Put it on a roll. Mr. Keating sees Cameron hesitating. He says, this is not a Bible, son. If you're not going to, you are not going to hell for this. Go on, make a clean tear. I want it, nothing left of it. Mr. Keating goes over to his room, turns to the wall, goes to grab a wastebasket. Cameron says, we shouldn't be doing this. Neil, one of the assistants, says, rip it, rip it. From outside the classroom, another professor, Mr. McAllister, walks by in complete disbelief as to what he's seen. Yelling, screaming, noises, pages being shredded up, balled up, thrown about, a complete mess. He walks in the room. What the hell is going on here? The boys all turn around in shock, stop what they're doing. Charlie stuffs a ball of paper in his mouth. Keating emerges from the back of the room with the waste paper basket, and Mr. McAllister says, what's going on? Mr. Keating says, I don't hear enough ripping. Mr. McAllister says, I'm sorry. I did not know you were here. I am. Ah, so you are. Excuse me. Mr. McAllister backs out of the room, again in complete disbelief of what he's saying. In fact, he's probably going to go talk to the dean or something. Mr. Keating says, keep ripping, gentlemen. This is a battle, a war, and the casualties could be your hearts and souls. Mr. Keating holds the basket out to Charlie, who spits out the wad of paper. The other students start tossing their balls of paper in. And this is where the lesson comes in. This is where, for centuries and for decades, some students may have lost the point about what education is about and the purpose of education. Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Armies of academics going forward, measuring poetry. No, we will not have that here. No more Mr. J. Evans Pritchard. Now in my class, you will learn to think for yourselves again. No, you will learn to savor words and language. No matter what anybody tells you, words and ideas can change the world. I see that look in Mr. Pitt's eyes, like 19th century literature has nothing to do with going to business school or medical school. Maybe Mr. Hopkins, you may agree with him saying, yes, we should simply study our Mr. J. Pritchard and learn our rhyme and meter and quietly go about the business of achieving other ambitions. I have a little secret for you. Huddle up. Mr. Keaton gathers in the center of the room, pushing out desks. So kind of like a quarterback in a team huddle. All of his players standing around him, waiting to get the secret play that's going to win the game. He says, we don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race. And the human race is filled with passion. Medicine, law, business, engineering, these are all noble pursuits and necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, love, these are what we stay alive for. To quote from Whitman, "O me, O life, of the questions of thee reoccurring, of the endless trains of the faithless, of cities filled with the foolish, what good amid these, O me, O life?" Answer, that you are here, that life exists, an identity, that the powerful play goes on, and you may contribute a verse. That the powerful play goes on, and you may contribute a verse. Mr. Keaton looks around at all the boys' faces. He looks deep into their eyes to be able to read what their soul is saying, what their heart is screaming out for. The question of their life. And he tells them, what will your verse be?